here. Greetings from Johns Hopkins University. We are the Office of Multicultural Affairs, and we are embarking in a new endeavor. And so a little bit more into that in our presentation. But first, we wanted to just make sure that you all knew who we were. So the Office of Multicultural Affairs at Johns Hopkins University. I'm the director for the Office of Multicultural Affairs, Joseph Colon. And I have a great team and staff within that office. I'd like to give them a shout out, particularly Rezwana Zafar, Misty Lonzak, Emily Hickey, Cheryl Jenkins, and you'll hear more from our illustrious Kwame Phillips a little bit later. He'll be joining us. He has joined us. So we want to also acknowledge obviously the state of affairs of our learning environment and also our interactions now at the university and also beyond, and particularly around social distancing. And so we just wanted to acknowledge that many of you may be facing the effects of the pandemic. So our thoughts are with you and your families. And we just want to make sure that you're covered and know that you have a community out here. We also want to acknowledge the professionals still doing the work. We're probably working just as hard, if not harder, than we did when we were physically in the spaces that we call our offices. And so we just wanted to say thank you all for joining us during this webinar experience. We especially want to thank our students in particular. They are the driving force for a lot of this. We've actually asked them what they want, and so we're giving them what they want. And so they want more interaction. They want to be able to talk about race and ethnicity. We have over 100 people registered for this webinar. So we're so excited to be engaging you all in this opportunity. And so thank you for our students for creating this space really to really develop a sense of community in a very tough time, whether it's playing Pictionary or Scrabble online to actually watching movies on Netflix. So we thank you for doing that and also challenging us to think about innovative ways to engage. Want to kind of give you a briefing about what Digital Diversity Days is. It's a brainchild of ours. We actually were going to create something. We wanted to do something innovative. This was pre-COVID. And so it was accelerated and actually great timing for us. And so we really wanted to talk about a specific theme and topic. So this theme for this year will be around critical race theory and the lens in which other crit work has been done. So the subsequent weeks through April, you'll see the 23rd and the 30th are also virtual experience times from 3:30 to 5, in which we will get into other crit work that is related to the CRT work, critical race theory. So today you'll have two ways to interact, and Kwame and I will be facilitating those pieces so that we can help Professor Montoya kind of maneuver and navigate some of those pieces. So we hope that you can engage. We will expect you to engage, hopefully, as part of this whole process. And so you can engage through the chat rooms. So we'll be opening up the chats. And then we also want to allow people to have some anonymous, if they have some questions, that they can actually utilize the Q&A portal in Zoom. So again, this is our first time doing this. This is the first of 3. And so we're so delighted to have Professor Margaret Montoya. And I'm going to introduce Kwame Phillips, who I previously spoke about. He's our Assistant Director for Programming. Just wanted to give a shout out to him for pulling this together and really thinking critically about what this would look like and kind of putting this together and transforming it into what it is today. So I'm going to let Kwame get us started and get us moving. I want to make sure we have ample enough time so that our community and our professor can kind of get into the crit work. Kwame?
Awesome. Thank you, Mr. Joseph Colon. Thank you all for joining in on our first Digital Diversity Day, featuring Professor Margaret Montoya, who will begin to give us an overview on the origins, the outputs, and the leaders and the milestones of the critical race theory. The Office of Multicultural Affairs we do use the critical race theory to inform our work. And so it's a great privilege to have Professor Montoya. She's given me the privilege just to say Miss Margaret, but out of respect, I'm going to say Montoya in the introduction. So bear with me as I review her over her bio to give you a little bit more information about Professor Montoya. Margaret Montoya was born in Las Vegas, New Mexico, to Ricardo and Virginia Montoya. She traces her ancestry to families who have been in New Mexico since it was controlled by Spain in the early 19th century and by Mexico until 1848. She graduated in 1972 with her bachelor's degree from San Diego State University. Montoya has been a member of the University of New Mexico Law School faculty since 1992. She's taught courses in constitutional rights, torts, contracts, clinical law, and employment law. And in her seminar, she's examined issues of race, ethnicity, gender, culture, and language. She was the lead scholar of a comprehensive American Bar Association initiative that analyzed a broad set of information aimed at advancing racial and ethnic, gender, disability, and sexual orientation diversity within the legal profession. The result of the 2-year effort, Diversity and Legal Profession, Next Steps, a 68-page report, was released in April 2010 under her expertise. In 2009, the CUNY Law School of Law named her the Haywood Burns Chair in Civil Rights and gave the commencement address. And you can find that commencement address on YouTube. It was really a great address that she gave to the graduating class. She's the recipient of this prestigious Clyde Ferguson Award, given annually by law professors of color for accomplishments in scholarship, teaching, and service. Both the National Latino Law Student Association and the University of New Mexico graduate and professional students of color awarded her the Lifetime Achievement Award. She's also been named by the Hispanic Business Magazine to its elite Latinas and also have received the Kate Stone Award from the Albany School of Law for expanding opportunities of women. We are delighted to have you, Professor Montoya. To everyone that's viewing, you can connect and share this on your Facebook to viewers so they can also tune in through our Facebook Live. So now we'll turn it over to Professor Montoya.
Buenas tardes. Es un placer estar aquí con ustedes, pero también es un honor. Thank you so much to Kwame Phillips and to Joseph Colon, to the Johns Hopkins University Office of Multicultural Affairs for organizing this 3-part conversation. I want to acknowledge my colleagues who will follow, Robert Chang and Lisa Iglesias. I'm very pleased to be sharing this opportunity with them too. I am going to be using a Prezi, and so let me so it says you cannot share screen while the other participant is sharing. Okay, so now we can. Muy bien. So let me begin with a land acknowledgement. Baltimore and the Johns Hopkins University are located in the ancestral lands of the Piscataway people and the current home of 8 groups of American Indians, and today over 40,000 people in Maryland identify as American Indian. I work in New Mexico where Pueblo people have lived for thousands of years. Their values, creativity, and ties to the land continue to structure the social and political architecture. Land acknowledgement can be a hollow gesture unless we remember why we do it. We seek to remember the genocide and erasure of indigenous people with past and current epistemicide, the killing off of intellectuals, of knowledge, of language, of culture. but we do it also to disturb our own colonized minds and disrupt predatory discourses and the imperial practices of educational institutions. So let's talk about who is missing, who is in this Zoom room and who is not. Besides genocide, there are other oppressive forces that prevent would-be scholars and activists from joining us. So we bring to mind the economically marginalized, those physically unable to be present, the incarcerated, the deported, disappeared, detained, and the dead. If we were in a classroom together, I would ask you to think about the architecture of the building. I would ask you to think about who are the architects, who designed the space, who built the room, who painted the walls, who today maintains and cleans the space. And I do so because for the most part, we work in white space. And it's white space in terms of what spaces have elevated voices and what spaces are silenced. So we know that the classroom is built with a well. It has a desk, it has a podium, it has mics. It has many indicia of people who are privileged to speak. And in the same way, that classroom has spaces that are silenced. So in order to do race work, we must bend or warp white space. And we do so with our bodies, with our music, with our stories, with our dancing, with our artifacts, with speaking up, with activism, with our histories, our memories, our hopes, and our dreams. We also work in the context of time oppression. All of us are already 100% busy. And when we are asked to do race work, it is work that is done in addition to already overloaded agendas. I want to make some acknowledgements. We are working during a global pandemic that is causing incalculable suffering and death. We need to bring into this talk some of the empathy that is necessary during this time. We need to think about loving kindness. I'm going to be making some connections to the pandemic, but I'm hoping that this tragedy activates our compassion and deepens our commitment to work on eliminating inequalities. I salute the mothers and fathers of CRT, the known and unknown community activists and intellectuals who opened the doors for those of us who later were to do critical race theory. I thank my beloved family and treasured friends, my colleagues and co-mentors who deepen my understanding y profundizan mi concientización. Again, I thank Johns Hopkins for this opportunity. So I have begun with talking about land, about people, about space, about time, in order to give expression to my otherness. We people of color come into these workspaces and learning spaces with different worldviews that are typically silenced. We are asked to leave those at the door. We do so we give expression to this in order to activate what Mari Matsuda has called our multiple consciousness. That is that as people of color, that we see the world through different lenses, through race and through the lens of whiteness, and that we toggle back and forth between these different ways of viewing the world. We also talk about intersectionality, the idea that our identities are made up of different vectors. So part of my identity may be sexuality, or it may be gender, or it may be race, it may be language. Intersectionality is the idea that these concatenate, that they're nested, that they intersect, and that they're multiplicative. Now we use this word not in the sense of the mathematical sense, the multiplicative factor, but in the sense that rather than seeing these different ideas as adding one after another, that we need to see that, in fact, they are in conversation with one another, that we speak from the vantage point of all of these different aspects of our identity. But one of the observations is about intersectionality, is that it is about systems of interlocking systems of oppression. That is probably one of the most important derivative propositions of intersectionality. Today, we are increasingly faced with having to counter color blindness because it is the dominant stance of the white majority. And we will talk more about that. Before I leave these, I want to say, I want to use Kim Crenshaw's language, which I distributed an excerpt from her new book. She and others are editing a book called Seeing Race Again. She talks about colorblindness as being a technology of power. It fragments knowledge and it silos disciplines. When we engage racial power, dominance, and resistance, we can create new scholarly possibilities, and we open up new imaginaries to make higher education more relevant, more democratic, more creative, and yes, more intellectual. So I am going to put on my COVID mask. I don't even know if you can see me. But I put on this mask in order to do some signaling. So today we're going to talk about mask and máscaras and masking. I asked you to read an excerpt from my article. But I want to connect the idea that today we are being asked to cover our faces, to use cloth to cover our masks in order to protect others from our pathogens and to protect ourselves from the pathogens of others. But one of the principal purposes of using a mask during a pandemic is to signal to other people that we are in solidarity with the helpers, with the health providers, that we are in solidarity, in community with those people. So as we think about masks, we want to think about the fact that a mask can increase your invisibility. You can mask in order to hide. You can mask in order to be anonymous. You can mask in order to be hypervisible. And I am showing three pictures here. The picture on the left is the Zapatista women in Chiapas. In the middle, we have an Asian woman who is wearing a mask. On the left, an African-American man who is wearing a medical mask. We know that the pandemic has exposed some of the racism that is at the heart, not only of the larger society, but within the healthcare system. And so the Asian woman is shown there because many Asian people have been subjected to hate speech and other acts of racial violence. I'm showing the man on the right because he's being thrown out of a Walgreens by a policeman. Men of color have been prohibited from wearing masks, and there has been outsized policing around that. Here, this man is being responsible and yet is being responded to as if though he does not belong. And so when I talk about invisibility, it is the idea of people hiding themselves behind their mask. One of the functions of a racial mask, like I talk about in my article, is that in fact we are trying to hide some aspects of our identities. We can also use masks to become more anonymous, to assimilate into whiteness, if you will. When I construct myself to come and speak, it's a question about how I will present myself. Will I wear a huipil, for example, a Mexican peasant blouse, or a sweater? Will I wear a blazer? Will I put makeup on. All of those are part of the mask that people of color, primarily other outsiders, construct as a way of being in public space. So another thing that has happened recently with respect to COVID-19 is that there is increasingly a concern about the fact that there are disproportionate deaths among African Americans, Latinx people, and indigenous, and those in indigenous communities. And so the question is, why would a pandemic disproportionately affect people of color? The answer, I suggest, weaves together information from medicine, from health policy, from critical race theory. Different types of racism are implicated here. We're talking about personal, interpersonal, institutional, and structural racism. So one of the things that is important to know about as we talk about the origins of critical race theory is that there were policies that led to the opening of doors for people of color. Those doors are just barely ajar. But what I'm showing here is the fact that after decades of diversity and inclusion work, African Americans and Hispanic and other racial minorities are still very underrepresented as lawyers and doctors. You will see that our percentages hover around 5%. 5% for the Latinx community, 5% for African Americans, and about 6% within medicine. We cannot understand critical race theory without understanding the resistance to race-based diversity and curricular innovation. We have the repeated litigation to try and end affirmative action. Bakke, Grutter, Gratz, Fisher, right? All of that constitutional litigation was very much analyzed and unpacked by race critics. We were active in much of that litigation. There have also been repeated unsuccessful diversity projects. We can talk about the millions of dollars that the federal government has poured into pipeline projects for the health professions. We can talk about the repeated reports, the Flexner report and missing persons, about the demographics, about the underrepresentation of people of color in medicine and in other professions. So let's ask the question, what is it? What are we talking about when we're talking about CRT? Well, perhaps the simplest response is that it is an analysis of race, law, and power. And all of those words together make for many a seminar, but any one of those require a great deal of probing to understand what we're talking about each. The UCLA Critical Studies program answers that they seek to teach students that how the law and legal institutions erect racial hierarchies and how to use the law to dismantle those hierarchies. CRT is an academic movement that was born in law schools to produce knowledge from and about communities of color, and it is now widely dispersed through most disciplines. It has been met with ferocious critiques, just unbelievable pushback. Judge Posner from the Seventh Circuit has written that critical race theory turns its back on rational inquiry and reinforces stereotypes about the intellectual capacities of non-whites. Here he is invoking white supremacy and the idea that people of color are intellectually inferior, and that by creating a discourse that responds to race and racism, that we are reinforcing those stereotypes. We are, of course, rebutting them. We are debunking those racist assumptions. Scholars also accuse CRT of anti-Semitism, of undermining democracy, and impeding academic discourse. But critical race theory doesn't emerge out of the creativity and intelligence of people in law schools. Of course, I mean, that's an aspect of it. But we have to recognize that it is part of a social and historical process that began with people organizing in the streets. It is their sweat, blood, and tears that opened the door for us. And we draw on that, on the misery that is suffered by communities of color to do our work. And so we recognize the Black and Chicano civil rights movements, second wave feminism, racial and ethnic community organizing, the gay rights movement, ethnic studies, and I will talk more about critical legal studies, which is a white academic formation. Let me say just a little more about ethnic studies, because if you were to draw a Venn diagram of critical race theory and ethnic studies, there would be quite an overlap. Yale has had a number of protests in which faculty and student are demanding that the classes be consolidated into an academic department. Yale has refused. The Tucson School District is known for its successful litigation to keep ethnic studies in its high schools. There are a number of states that now require ethnic studies in their high school classes: Texas, California, New Mexico, among others. As we think about the origins of critical race theory, we need to acknowledge the singular role that Professor Derek Bell plays. He was a litigator in the civil rights era, and then he is offered and takes a position at Harvard Law School, becomes a tenured professor. And from that perch, he begins shining the light on Harvard that it is unwilling to diversify its faculty. Eventually, Harvard will hire a handful of African-American professors. Professor Bell continues to put pressure that they hire African-American women. At that point, he decides to leave, that in fact, he's going to leave Harvard. And it leaves a gap in who will continue the courses on race and the law. The students mobilize, all hell breaks loose, because in the negotiations with the dean offers them a choice, that the course can be taught by an excellent white professor or a mediocre Black one. This juxtaposition between white excellence and the mediocrity of people of color is something that we will hear over and over again. Typically, white people in leadership don't articulate that objection to our being in higher education. Another way that Harvard responded, that Harvard people of color responded to the lack of faculty diversity was what are called the Saturday schools. Professor Ogletree in the mid-90s invited faculty of color to lecture on Saturdays, and that was done again in 2016. And those lectures would become part of the articles, of the first articles in critical race theory. A second origin story is the Berkeley story, in which by the mid-1980s, there were enough students of color who had roots in community activism, and they began pressuring the school to hire more faculty of color. There is then the third origin story, which is really about professors and the development of published legal scholarship. And this is also linked to critical legal studies because they have a conference that is focused on race. By the late 1980s, critical race theory has organized itself into workshops that are held in the summer with the purpose of creating very high quality scholarship, because these scholars are now seeking academic positions, tenure track positions, and they are trying to institutionalize CRT as an oppositional discourse. Throughout this time, there will be a continuing debate about the role of white people in critical, in CRT, and particularly critical legal studies. So now let me give you my CRT origin story. My name is Margaret Montoya. I am a Spanish-English bilingual. I resist my assimilation into whiteness and embrace my Latinidad. I'm a code switcher since childhood. My Máscaras article begins in Spanish, máscaras, trenzas y greñas. These words comprise a linguistic and epistemological mask, a mask that is signaling about my worldview constructed from two vantage points, two vocabularies, different ways of knowing. In this society, in the US, Spanish is a racialized language. You learn to erase accents, to speak white. Use Spanish and you're seen as other, as not belonging, as different and deficient. I was part of the first cohort of students of color to go to law school in significant numbers, among the first to be accepted and to attend Harvard Law School. I was there in the 1970s before critical race theory would emerge. I was hired as a visiting law professor at UNM, University of New Mexico, in the early 1990s. And the Máscaras article was my first publication. The article is both a performance of masking and unmasking, and an analysis of the role that masking plays in the construction of our racial and gendered, our intersectional identities. I describe my mother braiding my hair and my sisters, making our trenzas when I'm 7 years old. My mother is teaching us about how to present ourselves in public space, because as little brown girls, we will be judged. The next story I tell is about the law school classroom and the masks we wear to control how we are seen and heard as we come to voice in public space. Do we reveal the taboo knowledge that we possess about unwanted pregnancies, the mess of periods, the Catholic shame of sexuality? Do we mask or unmask such knowledge? But we have other knowledge about eating government cheese and canned meat, a home with an outdoor toilet. We know about the climb into the lower middle class. We are class jumpers. I wrote this article before I knew other race crits. I would be invited to one of the last CRT workshops. I was in Puerto Rico when LatCrit was born. I have said many times that CRT and LatCrit saved my life, gave me a life and a community in academia. So we're going to pause now and we're going to take some of your questions. Take a breath.
So Kwame, do you want to start off with your any chat room questions?
Yes. So here we have a question. Can you talk a little bit more about what you think prevents schools from adopting and supporting more robust ethnic study programs?
Are we going to take several questions at once?
Yes.
And the last question that I guess you can also add into that, in what way is CRCT developing more today?
Okay. So let me re-engage the idea of color blindness. And we need to think about the fact that many of the people who are in leadership today, people who are in their 60s and 70s, and I mean members of school boards, principals, presidents of colleges and universities, you know, the business community, our political leadership. That cadre of leadership was born into a United States that was racially segregated. In their lifetimes, this society decided to dismantle that formal architecture of racism. This society was made to move from one way of viewing the world to another. And many people who are now in leadership pride themselves for having moved from a race-based orientation, that is a segregated, Blacks are inferior, browns are inferior, Native people are invisible, Asian people are to be excluded, from that mentality. And it was formally enforced, right? It was the law that was used to enforce that. And over time, the society moved to a position of color blindness. And so they see themselves as this is a moral development. They are loath to readmit race into institutions, into the curriculum, into hiring practices, because they do not see the fact that color blindness is a technology of power. It is a way of reinstantiating how we keep people out of being able to control their own existence. It is a way of structuring the way that resources are distributed in this society. A lot of people look at the schools and they say, oh my goodness, this school is overwhelmingly segregated. It is broken. My older daughter says, you are wrong to say that. These schools are fixed. These schools function this way. Segregation functions this way in contemporary America through policy choices. We do not have CRT in the curriculum in many law schools. You know, there is greater demand than there is access to critical race theory. And part of it is because the leadership still clings to this idea of color blindness. They are uncomfortable with the idea that people of color come in and that we have new and different ways of seeing the world, different mental tools. We have what is called cognitive diversity, and that we can make those spaces more intelligent, more competitive, more innovative. So let me say, I have been talking about some of the new ideas in critical race theory. So originally, when we were doing CRT presentations, we didn't begin with land acknowledgement. We weren't doing that kind of an inclusion tool. I want to call it a tool, not a gesture. But in talking about countering color blindness, in talking about intersectionality, we are talking about some of the new ideas, and I will be talking about that more towards the end of my talk. Should we go on?
We do have one question in the Q&A section. The question is, what are the pros and cons of those who do not identify as people of color applying critical race theory in various contexts to educate others? As someone who works a lot with diversity education, this is an issue that I come across frequently.
So this is an opinion, but my opinion is that critical race theory developed as a people of color formation. The workshops that I mentioned were by invitation only. They were meant to be a space of color. We frequently debated as to what it meant for people of color to be talking with and working with people of color, and what was the role of white allies within that. But I think that as race crits, we did not see it as our function to be teaching white people. I mean, it's not to say that, in fact, that isn't one of the spillover effects, right? That in fact, the analysis that we have developed is now read very widely. And in fact, it, I think, improves the understanding of anyone. But I think that the intentionality of the work was very much that we were trying to give expression to our own lived experiences and then to bring an analysis to those lived experiences. And that we needed to sit among ourselves so that we would learn the stories of the different groups, right? That we, because of segregation, were also segregated from one another. And that it took intensive education on our part to really become intersectional, to be able to be inclusive. And I think that we began from the perspective that we were already very educated into whiteness. The books that we had read, the people that we had studied, the people who were declared to us to be intellectually excellent were white people. So we were well informed about whiteness. And we were now moving to another landscape in which we were taking on the body of experience that is people of color, both in and outside of our borders.
Thank you.
Okay. As critical race theory was developing, there were internal debates and tensions and conflict. And I think it's important to know that, you know, race crits, that we had our own biases and that these biases would be worked through in the development of this scholarly movement. And so there were debates about who would be invited into the workshops. Gays, more Latinos, more Latinas, junior faculty. What issues were to be included within the CRT rubric? Homophobia, immigration, language. All of these were part of the tensions that led to the complexity of what is critical race theory. So I want to talk about its propagation and its reproduction. I want to talk about its dissemination across different racial groups, but also across disciplines, across faculty and across student cohorts. And I want to talk about reproduction. And here I'm talking specifically about creating academic pipelines to ensure that there would be younger race crits who would be coming into academia and gaining, hopefully, academic power, racial power within institutions. So in asking about critical race theory, we want to think about how the production was consolidated. And so there were a number of anthologies that were written. And there was, again, tension around these. Who would be included? What work would be included? Who would be the editors? And so primary anthologies were produced by Kim Crenshaw and other editors, Richard Delgado and people working with him. Adrian Wing put together anthologies on critical race feminism. At the top, you will see that I have bracketed one of the books. Seeing Race Again, about countering colorblindness in the disciplines, is a book that came out last year. And this is, again, by Kim Crenshaw and other editors working with her. If you're interested in where CRT is going, you could certainly begin with that book. When we are asked about, well, what does critical race, you know, what do you people believe? What are the central ideas? There has been resistance to creating a set of CRT texts because this was meant to be a big tent. It was meant to be an embracing community. And that if we tried to create tenets, that in fact, it would leave out many of the ideas and emerging concerns. This is an articulation put forward by Richard Delgado and Stefancic. So in the play, they say, racism is ordinary. It's quotidian, it's everyday. There's nothing aberrational about it. It's here and it's everywhere. There's the idea of interest convergence, that racism advances the material and psychological interests of white people, both economic elites and working class people. That race is a social, not a biological construction. That race and races are the products of social thought and relations and historical processes. That there is differential racialization. That is that different minority groups at different times in different places are racialized by the dominant society to meet shifting needs. And finally, there's the voice of color. That is that writers and thinkers of color communicate information about race in different ways, because they have different histories, and they've suffered different forms of oppression, and that this knowledge is not available to white people. That is the whole idea. In storytelling, we tell about our lived experience and those of our communities. Storytelling is one of the key features of critical race theory. And I have listed here what are some of the emblematic stories from race crits. And these are largely some of the older, the older race crits, although I wouldn't include Devin and Mitu in the older cohort. And I'm choosing some stories, and of course, there are hundreds of such stories. This is also a curricular movement. And one of the things that we needed in order to get it into the classroom was to have textbooks. And so we have race-conscious textbooks. By the mid-1990s, the critical race theory workshops had converged with LATCRIT. And so LATCRIT is born, as I said in my origin story, at a meeting that happens in Puerto Rico. And out of that meeting, there is a decision made that this group will continue to meet in order to center concerns around the Latinx experience. From the very beginning, the LATCRIT formation, the LATCRIT community was intersectional. There were African Americans, there were Asian Americans who joined this enterprise. And what it would be a long-lasting, because it began in '95 and it continues to today. And there have been, I believe, 21 conferences organized by LATCRIT. I will leave it to my colleague, Lisa Iglesias, to describe more about LATCRIT. Another grouping, this one of Asian Pacific Islanders, sometimes called APOCRIT scholars. I've listed some of the principal scholars within this group, but they didn't organize like LATCRIT. So this was a looser coalition of people who identify as Asian American. And here's a research brief that was done by UCLA talking about the origins, directions, and praxis of the Asian American critical race theory. There is also critical indigenous theory, which looks at the law of indigenous people as well as the internal law of tribes, which juxtaposes the idea that many of these people are outside of the borders of the United States. It's a transnational movement, but it's also about the land bases that indigenous people have within the United States. Some of the recurring themes in this body of scholarship include a very intentional centering of indigenous thought, values, and practices into the scholarship. Indigenous thought, both ancestral, that there was an ancestral intelligentsia that we can learn from. There is the nurturing of indigenous identity. It is a land-based identity, and it has both racial and political dimensions. Because the tribes are a separate sovereign from the states and the federal government, these political jurisdictions have power over the people of the indigenous people that they govern. This movement is also tied to a transnational decolonization movement. It cultivates intergenerational kinship and tribal relations that are different from those of other people of color. And they acknowledge trauma across the generations caused by the extensive genocide that was meted out to Native peoples. In the year 2000, UCLA, the law school, established a separately standing critical race studies program. It is the premier program for studying critical race theory. And pictured here, one of the outstanding faculty is Kim Crenshaw. I said earlier that I wanted to juxtapose the work of professors, the scholarly work that was being done by professors, with the activism that was being done by students. We have the work of students at Yale who put together a number of conferences sustaining the critical race theory discourse. Perhaps the most famous conference was the 1997 conference on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of critical race theory. There was a heated debate between Catherine McKinnon talking about white feminism and Angela Harris talking about feminism from the point of view of women of color. Out of that work emerged this anthology. This anthology is edited by people who identify both as critical race scholars and lat crits. So Frank Valdez, Jerome Culp, Angela Harris are part of that Venn diagram, and they're in that overlapping part. But you'll notice that they call this anthology a new critical race theory, a new direction after 10 years. On the 20th year celebration of RT, the Connecticut Law Review, well, there was a conference held, and then there were articles that were published. If you are interested in both a rear view mirror looking backwards and looking forwards, I commend the work in this law review. It is simply superb scholarship. The student activism that we talked about in the origin stories continues until today. The students last year put together a disorientation program for students in which they introduced critical race theory to them. They recite the history and they retell the stories of racial activism, including the race hatred that has been visited on faculty of color at Harvard Law School. Because the students have continued to pressure the faculty to hire critical race scholars, which they have not. I think they have hired only people who come in for visits, so there's no one on tenure track. The students have pledged to have an annual CRT conference. This was last year's. This year, unfortunately, was supposed to be taking place right now as we speak, but because of the pandemic, had to be postponed. So while I do not claim that Lori Cooper or Lorraine Bonner are race crits, their art, their sculptures, and their paintings do give expression to many of the ideas that we have developed in critical race theory. So let's take another break and take some more questions.
Awesome. So we've got a ton of questions, which is great. I'm going to try and synthesize as many as possible. One question came in around the Asian American community in particular, speaking about Andrew Yang's campaign. One of your slides depicted that Asian Americans have a high level in their profession or certain professions, but there's still challenges within that community. This question asks, how can we have dialogue on representation of Asian American minoritized populations in a way that acknowledges that they are well represented in certain careers while still acknowledging the struggles? And I'm gonna combine this one around color blindness. Would you think color blindness and embracing Americanness are still similar narratives? This was based on Andrew Yang's Washington Post article. And why do people cling to the theory of color blindness despite seeing our changing world where more people are trying to integrate everyone?
So let me begin, and I should have said that my colleague Bob Chang is going to be talking about Asian American critical legal theory. So I think Andrew Yang was he certainly brought diversity to the primary campaigns, right? You know, here's someone who embraces math, who embraces the idea that we're going to give people that the government is going to provide a guaranteed income for people. I mean, so he was bringing forth some very challenging ideas. And of course, those kinds of ideas were poo-pooed and dismissed until the pandemic, because now we have figured out that if in fact your workforce is sick, the economy collapses. and that the only way that a capitalist system works is if people have buying power. So you have to give them this guaranteed income. So I think that someone like Andrew Yang sort of straddles this idea between a model minority and really taking a more critical view of a concept like that. And the model minority says to African Americans primarily, but also Latinx and Native people, why don't you behave like Asian Americans? Look at their grades, look at their test scores. They just work harder, they apply themselves. But this idea that in fact they are a model minority amalgamates very diverse peoples, because we know that if you Pacific Islanders, if you look at people from Samoa, if you look at people from East Asia, people who came over after the Vietnamese War, many of them have very serious social problems. There is an overrepresentation of Asian Americans in the professions, in law, but particularly in medicine. In the way that medicine thinks about underrepresentation excludes Asian Americans, because, well, let me particularize that, because I've given you an overbroad proposition. So the way that medicine looks at underrepresentation is that it localizes it. And it really says to people, when you're putting together diversity and inclusion programs, you need to look at local populations. So in Albuquerque, for example, the underrepresented populations, which are important in terms of the signage in hospitals, for example. What languages do you need to post? You need to post English, of course, but Spanish, Navajo, and Vietnamese. Vietnamese because they are an underrepresented Asian population. So in order to understand the model minority theory, we've got to critique it and unpack, because it's both overbroad and it's under-inclusive. It's under-inclusive because, of course, there are many African Americans and Latino people and Native people who outperform all of the predictors, just like Asian people. And believe me, I understand the debate that's going on, that in fact Harvard has discriminated against Asians and closed the door to them, because in fact, if just their test scores and grades were taken into account, they would have more seats in the entering classes, pretty much across the disciplines, right? Harvard responds to that it's important for what is also called cognitive diversity, that you have a representative critical mass of different racial groups. That is really what we seek to do with diversity and inclusion programs. Color blindness and Americanism. Well, the power of color blindness is that in fact it embraces some key values within American democracy, right? Because color blindness says, look, I don't see race. I am blind to it. I don't even notice it. I don't want to notice it, because I am committed to fairness and equality. And that the merit that I seek to expound and to implement is one that takes no account of race. Well, in fact, we know that because this society has been segregated for generations, that the unequal distribution of resources, whether it's education or whether it's housing or whether it's home ownership. I mean, we could just go through virtually every aspect of American life disadvantages people of color. Maybe not so much popular culture, but I mean, so what I'm trying to say is that there is a reason why people link color blindness and Americanism. What we are saying is that if you want to live up to the real values of justice, equality, the 14th Amendment, Equal Protection Clause, right? That you must take race into account. So there has been a debate between Justice Roberts and Justice Sotomayor, in which he says the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race. Be colorblind, he says. And Justice Sotomayor answers, race matters. And then she goes into this explanation that if you are a kid in the barrio and you are speaking English and someone looks at you and they ask whether you can translate for Spanish, race matters. And she goes through these different life experiences of people of color. And she ends by saying, the only way of dismantling racism is through being conscious of race. Should I go on?
Yeah, so that we have a ton of questions, so we'll leave that for the end.
Okay.
So that way
Let
we
me go
can
on
kind of make sure.
and then I'm really looking forward to the questions.
Cool.
So in talking about the dissemination of CRT, I want to mention just a couple of areas. So I want to mention CRT in education, medicine, and then a little bit in science. Education probably has the most, they've created an architecture of critical race theory, and they now have many anthologies dealing with CRT in education. Medicine, let me go back. So medicine has really looked at issues of race through a lens of culture. And so there has, for decades been talk about cultural competence and really what are the cultural tools, the cultural communication tools that you need, which is different than talking about race. So let's talk about race in the hard sciences. So during the hearing before the Supreme Court on one of the affirmative action cases, Fisher versus Texas, there was a colloquy between Justice Scalia, and that is it's interesting to me to juxtapose justice with Scalia, but that's an opinion. But Justice Scalia and Chief Justice Roberts engage in this colloquy with the attorneys that is highly biased. And Roberts then poses a question. He says, what unique perspective does a minority student bring to a physics class? This is directly related. It is the analog to the question, to the response that the dean gives to the Harvard students when they are seeking to have a professor of color hired after Bell leaves. He gives them this juxtaposition of white excellence or people of color as mediocre. This is precisely what Roberts is doing. That there is this invocation subtextually of white supremacy. You will see that I have given you the link to a response that is given by 2,200 physicists who first of all denounce the question. And they say the more appropriate question to ask is, what unique perspective does a white student bring to a physics class, given that they predominate in numbers, that they are privileged within that space? And they go on to rebut the argument that is implicit in Robert's question. So let me give you another short story. Lisa Randall is a theoretical physicist at Harvard, and she works on issues of quantum mechanics and general relativity. And dark matter is a concept from general relativity. But you need to think about dark as having different valence there, right? And so she was in Boston and she was giving a talk about the idea that you need empathy to understand quantum mechanics, because you have to be able to step outside of your mental frameworks. You need to be able to see the world from another perspective. And so after the lecture, an African-American artist, Jefferson Pinder, stopped her and he said to her, I know this sounds like a crazy question, but were you really talking about race? And Lisa Randall, the theoretical physicist, says, yes, I was. And she goes on to explain this connection between the complexity of quantum mechanics, the empathy that we need to understand that, and the complexity of race, and the need to develop new mental tools, a capacity to step outside of our frameworks. And so I said that medicine has been much slower to use a race of lens. I mean, to use a lens of race to talk about inequalities. So let me talk about some work that I am doing with some colleagues in medicine. This is a mind map that we have developed for a technology that we call racial literacy. And we are asking the question, what knowledge and what skills about race do health providers need for professional excellence? And we are answering that racial literacy is an aspect of that. My colleague Brenda Pereira and I have been working with a group of OBGYNs of color. They are primarily abortion providers, and we have created an entity that we call CIRCLE, Centering Equity, Race, and Cultural Literacy in Family Planning. And what we have been doing is we have been lecturing in the conferences on family planning in order to change the dominant narrative, to center women of color as patients and providers. So one of the tools that we use to teach about race is storytelling. We use name and place stories. I have distributed this tool to you, this triad, as a way of, well, first of all, showing you some of the work that we're doing around identity. So this sense maker exercise comes out of people who are working in complexity. And in fact, you can find apps on sense making. And this asks you, with this tool, we are asking you to think about where on, this is for people of color, where on this triangle you would map your identity at age 7, when you're in high school, when you're in graduate school, and in your career, right? The idea being that how we think about ourselves, whether we think in racial terms, whether we think of ourselves as brown or black, whether we think of ourselves as more highly assimilated, is situational and it's developmental. Our identities change across this arc. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to give people tools where they can strengthen their racial identity, where they can identify the talents and the knowledge that go with it, because we want them to be able to support the proposition that their racial identity is a professional asset, that they can put that on their resume and they can then identify the tools that they have, the knowledge that they have, that enriches their capacity to do medicine. So CIRCLE, this group of OBGYNs, also looks at racial data. We are also looking at how we evaluate students for admission, residents for selection, professors for purposes of hiring, for being their annual evaluations for promotion and tenure, using a more holistic review. We are looking at other theories of providing healthcare. There is something called upstream medicine, which I think many of you may know, that certainly has aspects that overlap with critical race theory. When we are talking about older cohorts of critical race theorists and new ones, perhaps one difference is the emphasis on systems transformation. I know that you in Johns Hopkins are beginning to do systems thinking, and that you probably know about the iceberg. This is a tool for systemic thinking. The iceberg shows events as being the part of the iceberg that you can see. It is above the water. Below the water are patterns and trends, underlying structures, and mental models. What I have done is I have taken the iceberg model and I have applied it to COVID-19. So the event that we are looking at, what is above the water when this begins, is the clusters of people getting sick in Wuhan, in Italy, in Washington State, in Manhattan. And then there's a focus on communities of color because the disproportionate death rates in the Bronx, in Chicago, in New Orleans, Navajo Nation, and most recently, Sioux Falls because of the meatpacking plants. We begin looking below. We look at patterns and trends, and we see that there are previous coronavirus infections. There's data, studies, and reports. There are agencies that do nothing but look at these infections, and that the federal and state government have had policies and practices related to that. We look at underlying structures. First of all, the infectious disease protocols that you use testing, social distancing, lockdowns, masks, and vaccines. But you then have to look at the health system. We have a system where people get their health insurance from their employers. What happens when the economy collapses, where there is no employer? Then you have Medicaid, Medicare, the Affordable Care Act, the Veterans Administration, or you have millions of people without health insurance. But you have to understand that these systems show generations of systematic and intentionally deficient treatment, limited access to health care, and widespread provider bias. That the vulnerable populations that we're looking at are older people with comorbidities, people who are already sick, the Indian tribes and nations, communities of color. And then at the bottom of this iceberg are the mental maps, are the mental models, excuse me, and that you have to transform those in order to transform the system. This is the set of assumptions and values and beliefs and political models that control the system. We're talking about something like disaster capitalism, intractable social inequalities that are put in place through policy choices. We're talking about broken democracies, and we are talking about white supremacy. And here, the iceberg intersects with critical race theory. There are other COVID-19 concerns that intersect with race. For example, people are being required to complete their education, to complete their semester online or to work at home. These are examples of a neoliberal capitalist ethos. It covets productivity and output from its workers, but it does not have the requisite infrastructure or regulatory scheme to support those workers. And the pandemic exposes this. The economy depends on expendable, healthy, and quiescent workers. That's why there is so much resistance to labor unions. There's something called essential workers. Well, we know that those are health providers, but it also includes a huge number of low-income workers, many of whom are undocumented, most of whom are people of color, who neither have health care or personal protective equipment. And then we have such outlying effects as abortions, in which a number of governors have declared to be elective surgery and therefore to be prohibited. Here are some resources. And let me end by just listing some of the CRT contributions. So if we are thinking about racial discourse across the society, we see that critical race theory has changed the vocabulary, has given new ways of analyzing race. The entire system, if you look at media, if you look at books being written, if you look at the way that policies are being put in place, you will see that CRT has been very influential. In terms of knowledge production and producers of knowledge, CRT is now across disciplines. You can find some ethnic studies or critical race theory in kindergarten programs, and it is in many doctoral programs. Critical race theory is in the arts. You might hear it in the music of Immortal Technique or Lizzo, and I could go on, or all of you could go on better than me. Critical race theory is also a system to cultivate intellectual talent. In this insert that I have the names of many of the people from LATCRIT and CRT who have gone on to become law school deans, endowed chairs, to be prolific authors, public intellectuals, and thought leaders. Finally, CRT is responsible for widespread curricular change and pedagogical innovation. There are now many people who do critical race theory, even if they're not hired on as CRT faculty. Students continue to demand CRT faculty and courses, and there are new cross-cultural methods and tools. Thank you very much. I'm eager to hear your questions.
Thank you, Professor Montoya, for your great presentation. We have received a number of questions, but there's one currently in the chat from one of our scholars, one of our students. And the question is, to what extent is it the responsibility and the burden of students to fight for ethnic study programs? And is it not the responsibility of the administration to counter whiteness through ethnic studies program? They're asking from their perspective because Hopkins does not currently provide a comprehensive one like those at UCs, which this student finds frustrating as a Southeast Asian American. East Asian Studies is not an ethnic studies program. And that's their question for you.
So I think that I said that we work in the context of time oppression. And that is true for students. That in fact, students and students in demanding undergraduate and graduate programs often do not have the time, the resources, the energy that it takes to mobilize in order to make these demands. Let me offer another perspective. There are things that you need to learn so that you can go out and be excellent if you are going to work in this society that you do not learn in the classroom. You are not going to learn the knowledge and the tools about race at Johns Hopkins without forming student coalitions and student movements to pressure Johns Hopkins to change its curriculum and its hiring practices. I'm using Johns Hopkins as an example because I know that it is true. Going back to the time that I was an undergraduate, certainly when I was in law school, before there was CRT, we were pressuring the institution to accept more students of color and to hire people of color. That became true when there actually are these well-publicized events at Harvard, Berkeley, and other places, right? Those students were greatly advantaged in their intellectual development by the work that they did outside of the classroom. They learned all kinds of skills. They learned so much about the way that the technology of power around race is used by white leadership, right? And they were then able to analyze that, to write that, and to turn it into important CRT insights. I think that those of us who have done critical race theory have almost always been outside of these institutions, oppositional to these institutions. I hear you when you say that it can be a responsibility and a burden. But I think that it can also be seen as an opportunity. Excuse me. I encourage students that I mentor to look for opportunities outside of the classroom with other students in local communities, working with those communities in order to learn the tools and the other skills and the resilience that it takes to engage in these kinds of protests and demands.
Thank you. There are two questions, but I'm going to try to frame it together. The first question is, I was curious if you think that critical race theory needs to change in some capacity, since it came about during a different period of time from now, or how do you think it has adapted to the changing times? And then the other question is, if critical race theorists operate primarily in white spaces, do you think that the development of CRT is hindered by existing in white framework? And is a non-white space necessary to further CRT? And is this even possible?
So in the talk, I tried to show the way that CRT is an evolving and emergent discourse. You know, I mean, like I said, the preliminary observations that I made around land and missing people and time and space, I mean, those are really more recent ideas that are being incorporated and tools that are being used in critical race theory. I think that the explosion around intersectionality with, you know, virtually, I mean, it's being used in so many different ways. And I think that that's another expression of how CRT is developing. But I think that the biggest impetus for evolution and change are new cohorts of students and young professors who really bring new life experiences. I can tell you that the students in law schools today have had an exposure to different communities much more so that young people live less segregated lives than other cohorts of the population. I think that the popular culture that they're exposed to, the technology that they're exposed to, their ability to travel both through cyberspace and through physical space is different than earlier populations. So I think all of these are affecting, but it's also the work being done in the disciplines, right? Where including in the sciences. I think that for physicists to respond to the Supreme Court around affirmative action shows the development, the embrace of critical race theory or analyses associated with it by people who certainly don't identify as race crits, right? But who are willing to be influenced by the discourse. So this question that you pose about white space, you know, do we need spaces of color in order to do CRT? I think that was a more immediate question for the older cohorts. I think that we were looking for spaces of color and we were electing. Now, when I talk about spaces of color for purposes of lat crit, there were almost always a handful of white allies there. They were also allies who knew when to step back, right? That there were skills that were associated. There were, you know, times when Native and Indigenous people wanted to meet. I needed to step back. I don't identify as an Indigenous person. I'm a mestiza. I need to step back and allow that discourse to develop without me. Can I later come in and I have, you know, decades-long relationships with Indigenous scholars, but I still know that it is very important for these communities to be able to work by and within themselves, and that we have developed techniques for how we do that. I think it can be very healing to be in a space of color, particularly if you are involved in the day-to-day struggles around diversity, inclusion, countering color blindness. There can be a relief to be around people of color. And yet, as I say that, I'm married to a white man, a white guy, right? I'm 40 years this year. I've been married to him. And so, and I think that's true for, you know, many race crit women. So I think that all of these questions are quite complicated. And I think that it requires a capacity, not either or, but it's both. We want to be able to critique white space, to step out of it. And yet we recognize that most of our professional lives, our lives in the classroom, in the clinics, is lived in white space.
And I think Kwame is going to ask one more question. I know we're running out of time. We just want to make sure that we are being mindful of people's time. So
Sure.
you know we're coming up to the 5 o'clock hour, and we also wanted to give some more information about next program.
Great.
So Kwame.
Okay. The last question I think could wrap up the conversation is how can this is from one of our student leaders. How can we as students or young adults help communicate critical race theory to others who may not be familiar, like creating candid conversation discussions, especially now during this pandemic?
So I've been retired now for a handful of years, and this next part of my academic agenda is to move critical race theory and lat crit out of academic institutions into my family and into my community. And so this is a question that is very near and dear to my heart. I think that students can learn critical race theory in having discussions with their families. It can be very instructive for you to tell name and place stories around the family table. Do a family Zoom and listen to people's stories. You will learn things about your family, about yourself, that you didn't know otherwise. And then bring racial questions to that. Did people live in segregated neighborhoods? What work did they do? Were these segregated professions, or were they segregated workplaces? Ask about how people moved around in order to gain opportunity. The Southern migration out of the South and into Chicago and other cities in the North, extremely instructive. But I think it's also incumbent upon students to really look for anthologies. And the thing is, you don't have to read the whole anthology. You can look at the table of contents. You can develop skills that give you an understanding of landscapes. And then you can begin choosing things that are true to your passions. But I'd be happy to talk with any of you. I try to be accessible to students. And my joy in life, my passion, has been mentoring students who are interested in doing race work. I want to take this opportunity again to thank you all for your time and your attention. I want to thank Joseph and Kwame for inviting me. This has been an honor, and it has just given me so much energy to go back and continue making masks and doing other things that I'm doing, homeschooling my grandkids and staying hunkered down. So I hope all of you stay safe. And I hope that the pandemic leads to a more just world. I think that we have not had enough of an understanding of what is it that we need to respond to this pandemic. And what we need to respond is with loving kindness and other aspects that are motivated by our emotions. Thank you all very much, and our values.
Thank you so much, Professor Montoya. As you can hear, you probably can hear the virtual claps. This was an amazing time.
Well,
Snaps or waves.
I'm clapping for all of you. Thank you so much. It's been just a pleasure being here with all of you.
Thank you so much. We wanted to also highlight that we are, what we'll do is we'll ask Professor Montoya to answer the remaining questions, and we'll send it out to the registrants as to kind of make sure that we can kind of support you all, and we didn't want to leave anybody out, so we'll try and do it virtually and ask Professor Montoya to go ahead and we'll send that out to all the emails to all the registrants, okay? In the meantime, we also want to remind you that we have other critical race theory conversations happening. So Kwame, if you'd like to kind of, actually I'm gonna pull up and share with you all the PowerPoint that we have. So, Kwame.
So we look forward to having you all back with us. Same time, 3:30 p.m. to 5 p.m. Thursday, April 23rd, Thursday, April 30th. Join us back. We will send out the information for the Zoom. And also you can tune in and share this link as well, which will be live via Facebook. We will have Professor Robert S. Chang from Seattle, Seattle University. He's a professor of law there. And he will be doing a conversation around Asian critical race theory. And then April 30th, we have Professor Elizabeth Iglesia, a law professor at the University of Miami School of Law. And she'll be focusing more in depth on the Latinx critical race theory. We look forward to having you all a part of the conversation. And we also will send out evaluations so that we can get your feedback on today's experience and conversation.
And we're also going to make sure that we've recorded this, so you'll have access to it, and we will send the link as well so that you can gain access if you want to share with folks. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a great rest of the day, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.
Mil gracias.
And Professor Margaret Montoya is back to answer the rest of your questions. So first question out the gate is, how do we balance the need to use some sort of categorization of people for scientific purposes, like studying whether certain populations are more prone to get certain illnesses, with the CRT principle that race is a social construct?
Well, what we mean by race being a social construct is that there are social processes that lead to those categories. So we're not saying that medical research should not use these categories. We're just saying that we need to have a skeptical eye about what are the assumptions that attach to these categories. So, for example, I think that you need to be very careful that you don't start making assumptions that things are genetic, right? When in fact, they really are behavioral. And so I don't think that there's anything that suggests that research should not categorize people. The problem from the point of view of race scholars of categories that have been used within the context of white superiority is that it creates a power hierarchy, that white people have been at the top of the hierarchy and they have been assumed to be, they have been assumed to be more intelligent, more beautiful, more efficient. But what is particularly troubling is that it extends to good and evil, that these categories give people the impression that some people are evil, they're criminal. Excuse me, my voice is bothering me. And that's really where we need to bring the CRT lens. What are the assumptions? What are the belief systems? What are the values? But it isn't about categorizing. It's about how you use those categories.
Awesome.
As an Asian American, I am cognizant of the privileges that my racial identity lends to me. Although we are people of color, the Asian American community oftentimes benefits greatly from its proximity to whiteness and white supremacy, and very rife with anti-Blackness, brownness. How can Asian Americans show more solidarity to Black and brown people of color?
Well, thank you for the question, because I think that the text and subtext of your question is part of the answer. It begins with acknowledging privilege. But I think that we all have to be cognizant that we are both privileged and oppressed, that we are both privileged or not privileged, right? And that's particularly true for those that are now participants in higher education, particularly elite schools like Johns Hopkins, right? We are not here without being privileged. And I'm not, I come from a class jumping family, so I get it. But we emerge out of these institutions with experiences and credentials that give us entry into positions of significant power. And so we need to be able to describe for ourselves, how are we advantaged and disadvantaged, and what are the responsibilities that flow from that? So let me go back to the question, and that I think it can be overbroad and under-inclusive when we talk about East Asians as being close to whiteness and privileged by white supremacy. It is true that there are some subgroups, Japanese and Chinese primarily, but there are many Japanese and Chinese people who do not participate in relations of power. They do not have access to power. They do not have, right? And if we go back and we study the history of those groups, we see the effects of white supremacy, how the laws in California prohibited Japanese people from public school education. They were named. Chinese people were excluded by law, by the Chinese Exclusion Act. We need to go back and know that history, and that history needs to be communicated widely. And yet, at the same time, we need to recognize that there is an overrepresentation, and I caution the use of that, of Asian people in the certain Asian groups in the professions, and that can be a form of the unequal distribution of resources. And that I think that having the understanding that it's a responsibility for us to understand where we sit in these hierarchies of power is really the way that we begin to dismantle them.
All right, we have a couple more questions. So is there a connection between CRT and Malcolm Gladwell's theories in his book, The Outliers, specifically the theories addressing certain advantages given to people of color?
Okay, Malcolm Gladwell. And so first of all, let me begin. I mean, his Outlier book develops this idea that if you do 10,000 hours, right, that in fact you become adept at so-and-so. There's in fact a lot of scholarship to show that that can be a very class privileged point of view, right? I mean, most families of color do not have the capacity to give their children 10,000 hours of instruction in anything, right? Except survival, right? Getting through, getting out, getting, So let's really think about some of those ideas. But I think that I do think that there are advantages to being a person of color. And that's really what I am trying to activate when I say that our racial identity can be a professional asset. I think that growing up in a family in which everyone dances is an advantage. It's a social advantage to know rhythm and to know music and to be able to move your body in that way. It's an advantage to grow up in a family in which everyone is athletic, right? It's an advantage to grow up in poor circumstances when your family teaches you resilience. That in fact, you know, many of our families are dedicated to education. Even when we are in school systems that are deplorable, even where our families do not have the resources to get us, you know, music education or, you know, summer travel opportunities. But our families frequently provide us with experiences and resources that help us not only get into these institutions, but to thrive in these institutions. That it is people who have been disadvantaged that are the hope of this society. I talk to students of color all of the time. This society is going to change by the values and the behavior and the policy choices of young people. And I see young people as much more dedicated to an equal capitalism or a dismantling, a reordering of our economic system, a rethinking of democracy and voting, a rethinking of the privileging of certain rights and liberties over others. Young people are, I am so enthusiastic about young people. They know how to organize. They know how to use technology. They know how to behave with one another. And I think that those are the kinds of advantages that we learn both from families of color, but communities of color. But let me say, because the reason that I sort of like was skittish about the question is because I think that the subtext of that question is really an argument against affirmative action, right? It is an argument against any policy that is meant, any kind of choice that is made through the political system to advantage people who have been historically disadvantaged, right? I think that that's what it's getting to, right? And I happen to think that this society has crippled itself by not having a frank conversation about reparations, about the place of Native people and what genocide and erasure has done. That I think that this society is imperiling itself with its immigration policies. We need young, healthy people to come and do the work that needs to be done. It is, when we think about who comes in as an immigrant, they are healthier, younger, more innovative. They start more businesses, risk takers, they're better predictors, all of the things that you need in order to have the kind of economic growth that right now you don't have, if in fact you have a population that is diminishing, is older.
Thank you for clarifying that. Great context. I mean, yeah, you hit it right on the nail on the head. We have one last question, and Kwame.
How do you understand the racialization of diseases, and in the time of COVID-19, particularly, how has xenophobia been directed towards Asian Americans from all races, or towards African Americans during the Ebola outbreak?
So I don't know if you read the reporting that was done about the 2-year-old baby stabbed in an Asian American baby that was stabbed by a man who claimed during this hate incident that these were people who had come from China with the purpose of infecting Americans, right? White Americans. I think that this racialization is a part of a rhetoric that is chosen very deliberately and that is used by people who want to create a population that they can blame for this pandemic. This is not a Chinese virus. This is not a Wuhan virus. You know, we are going to learn much more about the progress of this disease. But when you think about the way that white supremacy works and how its premises are structured to create these pyramids of power, and that one of the principal things that has been used in these racist regimes, and we can go back to Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany is a good example because it is a racist regime among white people. It is Germans that decide to racialize Jews, right? Many of whom they looked indistinguishable, right? But they were able to create these categories and then disadvantage, create pariahs of this population group. And one of the first stereotypes that they create is stereotypes around disease and lack of cleanliness, right? That they were vermin, that Jews were rats, right? This identification in the mind that they are something that needs to be eliminated. And I think that those techniques of power, right? The way that operates, the way that you use race, moves from one generation to another. And what we have to do is we have to understand what is the connection between disease and white supremacy. Why is it that it attaches to, you know, I mean, when the president said at one point that he wanted to stop all immigration because immigrants were unclean, right? I mean, if you look at the sciences, if you look at medicine, if you look at the people who are coming in, so many of them are people of color. It just incapacitates us as a democracy and as a society when we start creating these stereotypes and giving them life. It is not true that Chinese people are diseased. It is not true, right? That, I mean, we do not yet know where this virus was born. We will know much more, right? But what we know in its spread is that the human body is much more alike than it is different. The course of the disease in people who are Latinx, undocumented immigrants, is not very much different from the providers who treat them and who then get sick. We get sick because we are all part of the human family. And that, you know, that there is something ennobling about that, that we who do race are heightening the differences between us and giving them meaning. But we do so as a way of creating community and solidarity and unity. And we do so by embracing democratic values of justice and equality and equity. We do not do so to emerge as subpopulations that are privileged over other populations. That is a complete misunderstanding of what the project is. We want another world, a better world, one in which we are all brothers and sisters.
Well, yeah, on that note, thank you so much for answering our questions. This was such a treat. Thank you really from the Johns Hopkins community, from the Office of Multicultural Affairs. This was amazing. And we look forward to future relationships.
Well, let me at this point say that I'm a Johns Hopkins mom. My daughter is a doctoral student in public health, in the social justice and health equity concentration. She's a critical race scholar also. But I wanted to thank you because I know that your resources are scarce and I thank you for using them for this conversation. I look forward to future work with you. I've learned a lot through this process, and I'm here. You know,
Awesome.
call on me. I'm happy to be part of your team.
Thank you.